An Introduction to Wildlife Habitat Assessment and Management in New Hampshire. This presentation is designed for anyone interested in becoming more familiar with forest, field, and wetland habitats, the wildlife associated with those habitats, and things you can do on your land to attract and support a variety of wildlife. The presentation is organized into 4 sections. Section 1 introduces some important terms and things you should consider when you are first getting started assessing habitat on your land. And sections 2 through 4 focus on the habitats and specific features to look for on your land, what wildlife species are associated with those features, and common approaches for improving habitat for wildlife. Section 1, Getting Started. So what is a habitat assessment and why do we assess habitats? The primary goal of a habitat assessment is to identify and describe what wildlife habitat types and specific wildlife habitat components occur within an area today. We then use that information to understand what wildlife species can be expected to occur within that area at the time of the assessment. We can do this because each wildlife species is associated with specific habitat types and/or specific habitat components. We can then use that understanding to predict how wildlife will respond to changes to the habitat, such as how they might respond to natural plant succession or changes due to development or climate change. We can also use that information to prescribe habitat management to create or enhance habitat opportunities for specific wildlife species. So these correspond to the basic steps we should take when we plan to manage habitat for wildlife. We should first identify and describe the existing habitats and habitat components as they occur now. We should understand what wildlife are likely to occur now before we do anything to the habitat. And then we develop management prescriptions, basically a recipe for what we plan to do based on our predictions for how wildlife will respond to the changes we make to the habitat. All right, so before we go much further, we need to be sure we're all on the same page regarding the meaning of some important terms I use throughout this presentation. And first is a simple definition of wildlife habitat. In its simplest terms, we can define habitat as the combination of environmental factors that a given species requires to survive and reproduce. And while each wildlife species has its own set of specific features that make up its required or preferred habitat, there are 4 primary aspects of habitat that all wildlife require, and those are food, cover, water, and space, or spatial arrangement of food, cover, and water within a landscape. Wildlife habitat components are specific features that allow wildlife to meet their needs for food, cover, water, and space. These are features we can observe, describe, and quantify. And these are the things to learn to keep your eyes out for and note anytime you're outdoors. And wildlife habitat types are visually identifiable environments composed of a specific combination of habitat components that are used by wildlife species that have similar requirements. To help you learn about the habitats and wildlife on your land, I encourage you to use 2 books that were published specifically to aid managers assess wildlife habitats and predict what wildlife will occur in those habitats. These are the Technical Guide to Forest Wildlife Habitat Management in New England and New England Wildlife, Habitat, Natural History, and Distribution. These books define and describe the most common habitat types you will have on your land, and they provide a list of wildlife species you can expect in each type. But the best way to understand wildlife habitat associations is to observe wildlife in their habitats as often as possible. With practice, you'll find that each species occurs predictably within certain habitat types, and that it uses specific habitat components within those habitat types to meet specific life functions. For example, chestnut-sided warblers occur in shrubland habitats, and they require dense hardwood saplings, which they use as singing perches, as foraging sites to find caterpillars, and as cover to hide their nests. The better you understand the specific reasons why a species uses specific habitat components, the better your ability to predict how changes to those components are likely to affect that wildlife species. For example, if we cut down all of the dense saplings in this shrubland, chestnut-sided warblers would disappear from this habitat for about 4 to 5 years, which is the length of time it would take for these saplings to regrow. The book New England Wildlife is the best resource for helping you become familiar with the specific habitat requirements of each of the vertebrate wildlife species that regularly occur in New England. Some wildlife species are habitat specialists that require very specific habitat components, and if those components are absent or removed, those species won't occur in otherwise ideal habitat. For example, monarch caterpillars require milkweed as their host plant, so a field without milkweed is a field without monarch caterpillars. Some species are habitat specialists that only occur in a very specific habitat type. One of the best examples in New England is the upland sandpiper that occurs only in short grass fields greater than 100 acres in size. Since such habitats are very uncommon in most of New England, this species is very uncommon in most of New England. Upland sandpipers are an extreme example of why the space aspect of habitat is important for some species that only occur in very large blocks of a particular habitat. By comparison, many wildlife require a landscape composed of a mosaic of different habitat types that they travel among to meet all of the daily or seasonal habitat needs. And the importance for how those different habitat types are arranged in relation to one another, and whether they are bisected by roads, starts to become clear when we consider differences in the ability of different species to move across the landscape. All right, so the first step for assessing what wildlife are likely to use your property is identifying where your property is located within the region and learning which wildlife are likely to occur in your region during different times of the year. There's a range map for each species in New England wildlife, and while these maps do need some updating, they are still a great place to start. Next, get an overall sense for the general condition of the landscape around your property. If you are in a very rural landscape, but the only habitats around you are mature forest, that will result in a different group of wildlife in your neighborhood than if you are surrounded by a mosaic of forests, fields, and wetlands. The wildlife that occur in a landscape of extensive unfragmented forest are different than the wildlife we would expect in a forest heavily fragmented by suburban development, and much different than the wildlife we would expect within a very urban landscape. We can provide habitat for wildlife in any of these areas, but to be most successful, we need to recognize the unique opportunities and constraints inherent within each region and landscape. And this is where working with natural resource professionals can help get you started in the right direction. Also, always remember that wildlife don't recognize property boundaries. Most wildlife require multiple habitat types, so unless you own many hundreds of acres, most species will use your land to meet some of their needs and neighboring lands to meet their other needs. Regardless of your property size, always try to manage your land in a way that complements the habitats on neighboring lands. For example, if your property is surrounded by a large apple orchard, it probably doesn't make sense for you to plant a lone apple tree on your property. So use aerial photos and visit with your neighbors to learn what habitats and habitat components are in your neighborhood. The best way to enhance wildlife diversity in your neighborhood and to attract wildlife to your land will be to provide habitat components that are rare or missing on surrounding properties. I'm able to attract a huge diversity of wildlife to our half-acre backyard by maintaining a unique mixture of shrubs and flowering plants, and by being the only one in our neighborhood who allows their lawn to grow wild, tall, and weedy. All right, so now let's turn our focus directly to your property. We want to first determine what are the primary habitat types that occur on your property. We'll now take a closer look at each of these general habitat categories, learn what habitat components to look for in each, and how to maintain and enhance those components to benefit specific wildlife species. Section 2. Assessing and managing forested habitats. When you get started, simply identify if the forested areas on your property are dominated by hardwood trees, softwood trees, or a mixture of hardwoods and softwoods. Specific forest types are identified in the field by differences in what tree species are dominant. So knowing how to identify the different tree species is very helpful, but it's not super important at this stage. Ideally, you would make a simple map that indicates where different hardwood, softwood, or mixed forest habitats are on your property. Next, visit each of these areas to look for the presence or absence of the following habitat components. In each forested habitat, first look for the presence, absence, and density of plants within 4 different plant layers. Beginning at the ground, look for an herb or ground cover layer, which includes the plants, fallen logs, stones, and leaf litter occurring within 0 to 2 feet above the ground. A shrub layer that includes shrubs and young trees growing 2 to 10 feet above the ground. A mid-story layer that includes tall shrubs and small trees growing 10 to 30 feet above the ground. And a canopy layer of tall trees growing 30 feet tall or taller. There are wildlife species associated with each layer. If you remove a layer, you remove those species. So ideally, we want all layers present, either all on your property if you have a large property, or at least somewhere within your local neighborhood. To support the greatest wildlife diversity in your neighborhood, try to provide layers that aren't available on other properties. Birds select their habitats based primarily on the presence or absence and the density of different forest layers. Some birds prefer a forest with a completely closed canopy with little or no understory. Others prefer a forest with small, single tree canopy gaps that let in enough sunlight to support a shrub layer or mid-story layer. And some birds prefer a forest with larger gaps that let in lots of sunlight and that have a very dense shrub layer. So landscapes composed of different forests that vary in their plant structure are most likely to support a diversity of birds and other wildlife species. Foresters and wildlife biologists use commercial timber harvesting as the primary tool for enhancing and maintaining diverse forest structure for wildlife habitat. Commercial timber harvesting basically means that the cut trees are sold to offset the cost of conducting this habitat work, and this often also generates revenue for the landowner. Through timber harvesting, trees are removed to create gaps of different sizes to create specific plant structure to encourage different wildlife species. Small forest openings, such as single tree selection and group selection, enhance cover and foraging opportunities for a huge variety of wildlife species. And as a general rule, these small openings tend to benefit wildlife that already occur within the forest on your property. Larger openings, particularly clear cuts, are used to create large areas of young forest or shrubland habitat required by numerous wildlife species. This includes 36 species of birds that require shrublands as their primary habitat. Openings at least 5 acres are most likely to attract and support these birds. And New England cottontails that require dense shrublands over 20 acres in size. Planned timber harvesting is also used as one of the primary tools for encouraging a diversity of seed, nut, and fruit producing tree and shrub species that will support a diversity of wildlife. We often use timber harvesting to remove trees to make openings that allow healthy oaks to expand their crowns or tops to capture more sunlight and produce larger acorn crops. And we remove trees that overtop berry producing shrubs to provide these shrubs with sunlight to enhance their fruit production. When you're on your land, look for the presence or absence of cavity trees. This includes standing dead trees that we call snags and live trees with holes or cavities. Here in New Hampshire, there are about 40 species of wildlife that require snags or cavity trees for habitat. When timber harvesting, we should leave all snags and ideally all large diameter cavity trees uncut whenever possible. Each cavity using wildlife species requires trees larger than a certain minimum diameter to meet its nesting or denning needs. As a general rule, bigger is better for wildlife, meaning that larger diameter trees can accommodate a greater range of wildlife body sizes than smaller trees. Cavity trees 24 inches and larger in diameter are able to accommodate even our largest cavity using species, the black bear. Do you have dead and down woody material on your property, such as logs, fallen limbs, stumps, and upturned trees? Many small mammals spend a large amount of their time within, under, or near coarse woody material in forested habitats to avoid predators. Many amphibians and snakes also use coarse woody material and other objects as cover from predators. Snakes are here hunting too, but they themselves are also vulnerable to predators such as hawks and owls if they venture too far from cover. All right, in this next section, we'll discuss considerations for assessing and managing field and old field habitats. Fields can be recognized as upland or non-wetland openings that are dominated by herbaceous plants, which are non-woody, and these habitats contain few or no trees or shrubs. As a wildlife biologist, I distinguish different fields based on how they function as wildlife habitat. As habitat, fields can be grouped into one of two primary types: fields that function as grassland habitat and all other fields. I'll first discuss grassland habitats. Think of grassland habitats as large fields. Fields that are at least 5 acres, but ideally greater than 30 acres in size. These large fields are required nesting habitat for a small number of grassland-dependent birds that we refer to simply as the grassland birds. Populations of these birds are declining dramatically throughout their range, but especially here in New England, primarily as a result of habitat loss. Two grassland bird species that are most likely to occur on lands owned by private landowners or communities are the bobolink and the savanna sparrow. Bobolinks require fields at least 5 to 10 acres in size for nesting, and savanna sparrows rarely nest in fields less than 20 acres. Two additional grassland bird species you might encounter are the eastern meadowlark and the grasshopper sparrow. These birds rarely occur in grasslands less than 30 acres, and both are listed as threatened species in New Hampshire. To function as habitat for grassland birds, a field not only has to be large, but it must also be very open. And very open means there should be no trees or shrubs growing within the field, and the field should be wide, not narrow. So think blocky square or rectangular fields, not long and narrow fields. For example, here is a field that is large enough to be a grassland, but it's too narrow to function as grassland. The reason it's too narrow is because grassland birds typically avoid nesting in fields where the field edges are close to the center of the field. And this is because grassland birds prefer to nest as far away from field edges as possible. These birds make their nests directly on the ground, and this makes them especially vulnerable to predators that tend to hunt along field edges. So these birds tend to only nest in large fields, and they tend to locate their nests near the center of these fields. Grassland birds are nesting and raising their young between about mid-May through the end of July. Fields that we manage as nesting habitat for grassland birds should be mowed once each year, no earlier than August 1st, and the cut grass should be removed. This yearly mowing keeps the field dominated by grasses rather than allowing wildflowers and young shrubs to grow up in the field. Mowing after August 1st is late enough that nests and fledgling birds won't get destroyed by mowing equipment. I consider all fields that are unlikely to function as nesting habitat for grassland birds as other fields. These include any fields less than 5 acres in size, fields of any size that have trees or shrubs growing within the opening of the field, and fields that are long and narrow, or those that are irregular in shape, with peninsulas of trees that extend towards the center of the field. These fields don't provide grassland birds with an area to nest away from the field edge. In any field where we are not trying to maintain nesting habitat for grassland birds, the habitat goal is usually to have the field support the greatest variety of wildlife as possible. The best way to do that is to allow wildflowers to grow up within the field. This is accomplished most easily by reducing how frequently the field is mowed. Mowing only once every 2 to 3 years allows a variety of flowering plants to grow up naturally into a field, but this frequency of mowing usually keeps a field from reverting to shrubs. A way to further enhance habitat diversity is to divide a field into sections and then mow the different sections in different years so that you never mow the entire field all at once. Here, the recently mowed short grass areas provide ideal foraging habitat for American robins, mourning doves, chipping sparrows, northern flickers. And in large openings, this short grass may provide hunting habitat for American kestrels and red-tailed hawks. The areas that are left unmowed provide numerous habitat benefits, including providing a diversity of flowering plants to support pollinating insects. And greater insect abundance improves foraging habitat for eastern bluebirds, swallows, eastern phoebes, and bats. Flower seed heads provide important fall food for American goldfinches and winter food for juncos and common redpolls. Many pollinators also lay their eggs in flower stems, so leaving these unmowed supports healthy pollinator populations. Tall grass and wildflowers provide nesting cover for wild turkeys, fawning cover for deer, and summer cover for turtles. Tall grass areas will develop a thatch layer of dead grass that provides ideal cover for small mammals and snakes, which provide important food for foxes, hawks, and owls. Now, there's all sorts of ways you might divide a field into sections, but I usually set up a mowing rotation so that only one section gets mowed each year, and every section gets mowed about once every 2 to 4 years. Fields that are mowed less frequently, like once only every 5 years or so, tend to get shrubby. And we see a huge increase in the number of wildlife species that will use a field once the field gets really shrubby, around the point when shrubs start to cover at least 30% of a field. At this point, our field is now considered old field or shrubland habitat because it now supports wildlife species that require shrublands. So what defines shrubland habitat? Shrublands are upland openings that are usually dominated by a combination of shrubs, saplings, grasses, wildflowers, and ferns, and there are few or no overstory trees. If there are trees, they are spaced widely enough to not inhibit sunlight from reaching the shrubs. Shrublands go by a variety of different names, including old field, early successional habitat, and thickets. And they support many of the same wildlife species as young forest shrublands that are created by clearcutting. Creating shrubby old fields is accomplished by simply allowing shrubs and saplings to grow up into a field naturally. Or we use timber harvesting to clear an area of forest and then allow the trees to regrow naturally. Once shrub species are established, you don't really need to ever cut the shrub species. But eventually, you will need to periodically cut trees that begin to overtop and shade out the shrubs. In a small shrubland, this can be done using a chainsaw or a brush saw, which is basically a weed whacker with a saw blade. You basically schedule one day or weekend each year and you cut out all of the tallest saplings. In larger openings, we typically use a brontosaurus or a Rayco style forestry mower to mow the trees about once every 7 to 10 years. This opening was mowed flat because it was an overgrown clear cut that was all tree stumps and few shrub species. We usually have these mowers mow around any shrubs. On large properties, we usually just allow clear cuts to grow up, and we make a new clear cut somewhere on the property once every 10 to 15 years. Okay, I'll finish this presentation with considerations for assessing and managing wetland habitat types. There are many different types of freshwater wetlands that occur in New Hampshire. Wetland types are identified by differences in the amount and type of vegetation that covers the wetland surface, and by whether they periodically dry up or remain permanently inundated. Almost all vertebrate wildlife species use wetlands at some portion of the year or during certain life stages, and each type of wetland has specific wildlife species that are associated with it. Most ducks, loons, grebes, herons, and osprey are all very closely associated with water, and they meet all or most of their habitat requirements within or very near to water. Beavers, muskrats, river otter, mink, and water shrew would not be expected to occur on properties where wetland habitats were not nearby. And throughout most of New England, water is an especially important habitat for moose during the summer, where they can submerge their bodies to keep cool and eat aquatic vegetation. Certain amphibians such as bullfrogs, green frogs, and mink frogs conduct all of their life activities within the water. These species require wetlands that remain permanently inundated throughout the year, and they rarely are observed far from the water's edge. Other amphibians, such as spotted salamanders, marbled salamanders, and wood frogs, spend the majority of their year in forested habitats, but they require wetland habitats such as vernal pools for breeding. Wood frogs and marbled salamanders are unlikely to occur in a forest unless there is a temporary pool somewhere nearby. So while it's important to conserve vernal pools for these wildlife, how we manage the forest around these wetlands is just as important. Similarly, turtles require specific wetland habitat types, but most species also regularly use field and forest habitats during different seasons of the year. The type of wetlands on or around your property strongly influences what turtles you can expect on your land. Painted turtles and snapping turtles occur in most types of wetlands and therefore are usually the most common turtles you will see. Blanding's turtles and spotted turtles occur in marshes or shrubby wetlands, so these types of wetlands must occur somewhere within the local landscape to expect these species. Wood turtles are associated with rivers and streams, and although uncommon, box turtles can occur in a wide variety of forested and field habitats because they are primarily terrestrial and don't require wetlands. All of the turtles prefer to lay their eggs in dry, sandy soil, such as occurs along roadsides, driveways, and gardens, and they may nest over a half a mile away from water. During the hottest portion of summer, turtles require cool microhabitats to escape the heat. These include ephemeral wetlands such as vernal pools, small water gardens, and areas with tall, dense grass or wildflowers. So how the landscape around wetlands is managed plays a large role in how that landscape will function as habitat for turtles. Now here in New England, we usually do very little or no active management within most wetlands. Most of the habitat improvement we conduct in relation to wetlands is management along wetland edges. As a general rule, we should maintain existing tree cover and shade immediately over streams and vernal pools. Shading is important for maintaining cool water temperatures and dissolved oxygen, which are critical habitat features, especially for brook trout. Fallen branches provide shade and attachment sites for amphibian eggs, and leaves support aquatic invertebrates that are important food for trout and amphibians. Whenever possible, leave or add fallen logs in the forest around wetland habitats. Rotting logs are especially important for amphibians, which must retain their moisture either to breathe or to avoid desiccation. Woodland amphibians, including Jefferson salamander, wood frogs, and redback salamanders, often spend a large proportion of the summer under fallen logs because the ground around these logs is often significantly cooler and has greater moisture content than the surrounding forest floor. Redback salamanders often congregate together and overwinter inside rotting logs. We should be retaining cavity trees throughout our forest, but cavity trees at least 18 inches in diameter are especially important near wetland edges, where wildlife such as raccoons, opossums, and gray fox are likely to den, and ducks, including wood ducks, mergansers, and goldeneyes, prefer to nest. Wetland edges are where you are most likely to find many different types of native fruit-producing shrubs. When timber harvesting or cutting firewood, look for opportunities to remove individual trees or small groups of trees that overtop the shrubs to provide them with the sunlight energy they need to produce abundant fruit crops. Tall, dense speckled alder growing along wetland edges or in wet fields provide ideal cover for woodcock when they are foraging for earthworms. We often use a forestry mower to periodically cut the alders in small groups or patches, which stimulates these shrubs to resprout vigorously and is a good way to maintain their cover value for wildlife. Finally, if you have a beaver pond and would like to encourage beavers to stay or to return to a pond they have abandoned, you might consider creating small clearings immediately adjacent to the pond to create abundant grasses and hardwood stump sprouts that are beavers' preferred food. If you don't want to encourage beavers, be sure to locate such openings at least 100 feet away from wetland edges. Timber harvesting around wetlands requires care and may require special permits. Anytime you are considering cutting trees anywhere on your property, you should first consult with a professional forester to help guide you through the process to ensure your objectives are being met and that the work is conducted following all laws and best management practices. Here in New Hampshire, your first call should be to your Cooperative Extension County Forester, who can visit your land for free to help get you started and direct you to professionals you can hire to plan and implement habitat improvement projects on your property. Our Extension Natural Resources team of forestry, wildlife, and land conservation specialists work in close cooperation with the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Lands, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service to help private and community landowners with all aspects of land stewardship and conservation. This includes helping landowners enroll in programs that can help you pay for forest and habitat improvement projects on your land. If you have questions or comments about any of the information in this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me at matt.tar@unh.edu.